Okay, so I'll begin again. If you heard me, great, but for the benefit of everyone else, this talk's all about decentralized website communication with Webmention. And I'm James. I'm a technical marketer by day. I work for a company called Roboflow. I'd love to talk about computer vision all day, but I promise Codementor this talk would be about Webmention. So that's what we'll focus on. My domain name is jamesg.blog. Where I publish frequently about coffee in the indie web. The indie web being a community of people across the globe that's been around for about a decade now, all dedicated to the ways in which we can express ourselves online through personal websites and really content ownership. And by night, I play around with my personal websites. I just like having fun there, and I write open source software too. Now, the problem that we're going to talk about, and where Webmention constitutes a solution, is has been created by large social media platforms, collectively referred to by some as silos. So silos control how we interact with others online in terms of the way in which content is displayed, how it's displayed, where it's displayed, and also the way in which content is represented. So on some platforms you can post only video, on some platforms you can post only text. But what this means is some platforms have achieved a great degree of specialization in, say, video content or short form content, but you're beholden to the platform, which can change over time. They can change their policies on what's on the way in which they display content, and you just have to go with the flow, really, which means that over time, if a platform no longer aligns with your values, for example, or if a platform changes their UX in a way that you find difficult to manage, then there's not much you can do. They have your content without doing a full export and then being in this position of, well, what do I do now? But it doesn't have to be this way, because ultimately the web was not designed to be owned by a small number of companies who collectively exert great influence over the way in which we express ourselves. Rather, we can build our own way, just like the web itself was built in its own way. There were no rules when HTTP was defined, and people figured out a way to allow information exchange. So that's where Webmention comes in. Webmention is one piece of solving the aforementioned problem. With Webmention, I can notify another site that I have written something about that site. So let's say I'm reading a blog post written by somebody and I want to say, hey, that was cool. Or maybe I have a question about their content. I want to go deeper, or I think there's a factual inaccuracy in their text. What I can do is send them a Webmention, which is just a quick HTTP request saying, hey, I wrote about your site. And with some additional semantic information, my post that I create could be indicated as a like, or a comment, or a bookmark, or even a response to a poll or an RSVP, with only simple semantics. This way, I'm able to enable many different ways of expression in response to someone else's content and own that on my sites. Importantly, Webmention, which I'll call mentions throughout this talk, is a standard. So it works on any site that complies with the spec. And thankfully, there's been dozens of people who've implemented Webmention, who have it running on loads of different sites. And so as a developer, you can just focus on configuration rather than having to read a full spec and implement it from scratch. So let's start with a demo. This is a page of my personal website. And this was me writing a blog post on an extension I was writing called highlight.js. I have my blog posts, lots of text and some images. And then toward the end of the post, I have this responses section powered entirely by Webmention. So there's no comment form, there's no text box, although I could make one. Rather, there's just an invitation, send me a Webmention. two people did. We had Ton and Jan publish two separate responses to my content. A question was asked here, and then this seems to use the title of my post, and I can always click in further to see what the person's written. So in this case, this person who's running an entirely independent site that uses probably none of the technologies mine does, has been able to write a response and notify my site of that. Notably, my site's static, which is to say that I didn't have like a complicated server running that was listening for content on the web. This person just sent a request to a server saying, hey, I wrote something about your posts. And they're free to present this in the way that they like. They've got fancy quotations, they've got tags, and I can even respond to their site and leave a comment there too. And equally, if I go back to the responses to the other person's site, they have an entirely different way of representing content. So this is what Webmention is in a nutshell. Here they've even got weather. It's a way to post something online and inform somebody that you've posted something online too. So with that said, that was just one example on my site. We can talk about what you get. So by sending mentions, you post content on your site, which becomes a canonical copy that you own. And then that response can show up on someone else's site too. And ultimately, the site owner doesn't need to share that response either. So sometimes I have opened up a section on my site that's like, hey, send me a web mention, but I don't show them anywhere. So if you send a web mention to my homepage, I'm still going to get it, but nobody else will see it. So in that way, it can act as both like a pseudo private service for sending like a, hey, this is a cool post, or as a full-fledged commenting service. And with some additional markup, as I said, you can give some context about your post. In the example I just showed, there were two comments, but my comment could be a like, or it could be a repost similar to a retweet, or it could be many other different types of content on RSVP. But how does it work? So to receive a mention, you need to have a Webmention endpoint set up. And to do so, you can really outsource it to a service. The one that we'll use is called webmention.io, but it's not the only one available. There are other implementations, and you're even free to implement your own. Candidly, Webmention was the first W3C specification I ever implemented. I didn't feel scared by it in the way that I felt with so many others. It was comparatively approachable. With that said, though, we are going to come out of here and use webmention.io to receive web mentions. To get started, we can go to webmention.io, which is a service that takes those HTTP requests saying, hey, I linked to your site, and then processes them. It's going to ask us to sign in with our domain name. This is where a separate standard comes in, called indie-off. Now, for this demo, I'm going to be using a site called codename.lol, which is really my excuse to use a poorly informed domain name that I decided to buy a few weeks ago. I had no other use for it, so I thought, hey, why not use it for this talk? This is a simple website. It's just one HTML file, 50 lines of code, nothing particularly special. I've got like a comment saying, hey, I liked reading this post by Aaron Preki on there. And in the source code of my site, I have 3 special tags. These you can copy yourself, and I'll put a link to this code in the Zoom chat toward the end. But using these 3 lines of code, I essentially say to another service called an indie-off provider, hey, I want to use your authorization and token endpoints to sign in. And I also want to be able to authenticate with GitHub. Similarly, I could put an email address here or a Twitter link or various other things. But in this scenario, by putting these 3 tags on my webpage on codename.lol, I assert that firstly, I own this because I've put those on there. Secondly, I want to delegate an authentication server. And then thirdly, I want to be able to sign in with GitHub. And that's why we're going to sign into webmention.io, not with an email address, but with our domain name. So I can type in our codename.lol site and click sign in. I'll take a little moment. And then that site that I approved to do my authentication for me, indieoff.com, has found that I support GitHub authentication, and it's going to ask me to sign in. And after a quick moment, we now have a Webmention account associated with our domain. And honestly, setting up Webmention is as easy as copying these 2 lines of codes. These 2 lines of codes, firstly, will tell any person going to your site or any computer going to your site where to find both your Webmention endpoint and also pingback, which is an antiquated alternative. Although it has many limitations, there are still it's there for backwards compatibility should you want to use it. So we can copy these 2 lines of codes and then put them onto this website that we made. I can copy them into the head tag and then click commit. And then now our site can receive web mentions. That's all we need to do. Webmention.io will handle the actual receiving part because my site is just a static HTML file, but there's nothing else I need to do. With that, we can go back to the presentation. We now have everything in place to receive our Webmention. So as I said, sign up to webmention.io, we add the Webmention link to our site, and now we can receive Webmentions. But now, how do I actually send a Webmention? So let's say I have another site called jamesg.coffee. Let's say that on jamesg.coffee, I want to be able to write a post that says, hey, codename.lol, I like your sites. I can do that, and I can have it show up on codename.lol too. So with that said, I'm going to go to jamesg.coffee and I will write a post. On jamesg.coffee, I'll write a post saying something like, this is a cool blog. And then maybe like, hey, I like your site. And then we're going to add in the all-important link. I'm doing this manually because my site software doesn't support fancy links in this editor, but that's okay. And I'll link to, rather than jamesg.coffee, codename.lol. And then in reply to your site. So here I'm just creating a post on my site, jamesg.coffee, that's this a cool blog, and then I publish it. Now, I've just said that this codename.lol site's cool, that's great, but codename.lol doesn't know that yet. Codename.lol and webmention.io are not scraping the internet looking for different sites that have written a response to their posts. Rather, we need to inform them, which is where Webmention comes in. There's a separate tool we can use for that called Telegraph. Telegraph, again, which I can sign into with my domain name, allows you to send a Webmention. This can be entirely automated because a Webmention is just that HTTP request to an endpoint. But it's a bit more intuitive in a demo to show a live tool that does this. So I was playing around with this a bit earlier, so we've already got one here, but sign in with Telegraph. And because I signed in with my domain name and GitHub earlier, I could just do the same thing. And then I'm signed into Telegraph too, using my domain name. I'll take this post that I wrote, like, hey, I like your sites, and then publish, and then copy it into Telegraph. The source being where I wrote the content, and then the target being where I want to receive the content, which in this case is codename.lol. And then I click send. And that's it. Our site has now received a comment. So I wrote something on jamesg.coffee, and now codename.lol, or at least the Webmention provider for codename.lol, knows that I have that Webmention. So let's see if it worked. We'll go to our Webmention dashboard, and here's hoping. There we go. We have received a Webmention from one site to another site. But we could stop here and we could say, hey, this is cool. People can send me Webmentions. But we're missing a key part, which I think is one of the most fun parts. So just to recap, when we use a tool like Telegraph or send a request to a Webmention endpoint ourselves, we do the Webmention discovery to find that endpoint that we discussed earlier. And then a tool like Telegraph sends that post request with the URL of the post you wrote and then the post you want to respond to. And yes, just a post request. And then the site's Webmention endpoint will do all the magic parts. So it'll process your mention, it will validate it, and it will also make sure that your mention does actually link to a site. The Webmentions would be pointless if you could just randomly send, say to a Webmention endpoint, hey, this site exists. There needs to be a link from, in my case, jamesg.coffee to codename.lol. Then after that, you can do something with the mention. You can store it, you can send a webhook, you can kick off some sort of job that you have running that's waiting for a web mention, or you can display it on your site. So yeah, as I alluded to earlier, now that you've received the mention, what can you do with it? You can display it on your personal website. And there's a plethora of examples here. This was one that I showed earlier on my highlight.js post with 2 comments, but there's also Aaron Precky, who here has a post that he wrote in response to one of his own posts. And then there's another post at the bottom written by someone else. And there's also all these likes here and reposts, and those were all either posted on Twitter and communicated over the Webmention protocol using a third-party tool we'll talk about later, or they were written on other people's personal websites. So here, Aaron wrote something, and from across the web, people could respond. And even then, he's got this URL bar here where you can write a post that responds to this too. And then there's another site, mxb.dev, who again has a completely different way of showing this information. And then there's adactyl.com, again, entirely different. There's the names here, there's the orange styling. And then there's Meg Appleton, who has the Twitter icon when it's a tweet, loads of mentions around the web on a post. And all of this is powered by Webmention. Ultimately, Webmention enables a more social web. So rather than just posting on your personal website and saying, hey, I wrote this thing, you can facilitate comments that other people write on their websites that they can display in whatever way they want, and they will still show up on yours. No longer do you need to defer to a third-party commenting tool that may or may not work the way that you like and that you don't really have control over. Here, you have full control over every piece of the puzzle. I've spoken a lot about all the things before, but kind of the which is to say, how do we show our mentions? To do so, we already sent one earlier. We're going to use an open source tool called webmention.js. Webmention.js lets you embed webmention comments in only a few lines of code. It's open source on GitHub. You can adjust it as much as you'd like, and there's a great README which explains loads of options. But for this talk specifically, we will firstly put in the requisite script, then we'll put in the div tag. I have a version of this on my personal website, so rather than do the copy step, I'm just going to go back to the codename.lol codes and then paste in this line of code that links to the webmention.js file on this GitHub repository. And then finally, we will take this div tag, which is where we actually want to put the mentions on the page. And then maybe I'll put it just below the a personal blog section. So in these 2 lines of codes, I have imported the library that lets me display mentions on my sites, and I have also set up a place to show these mentions. So 2 lines of code, we'll commit this code. And it does take a little while for it to show up because GitHub has to build it. And just looking in the chats, there will be a video recording of this on YouTube posted in the next few days by Codementor, to which there should be a link left on the Codementor events page. So with that, I'm just sort of waiting for GitHub. We have put in all the places to show web mentions on our sites. And if I look at source codes, we may, interesting. This is when I would really like a demo to work. What happens? We sent a mention. I promise this worked before the talk. This is super interesting. Curious. Let me try and send one of my old mentions to see if that works. We will go back to Telegraph, again, the tool we use to send mentions. And if I send this to codename.lol. Sure thing. There we go. So here's hoping we get this working. Maybe. So we have a mention. This mention was queued for processing. Curious. Okay, so I will not dig into this too deep, but we have all of the pieces in place to display the mention on our site. So we have sent a mention, we have been able to receive a mention, and also we should have been able to see a mention here, but it seems as though it's not appearing as expected. With that said, though, what I can do is go all the way over to this, again, highlight.js page. And this is using the exact same tech stack. So we have web mentions that display here. And yeah, with that said, so far we've set up a web mention endpoint. We've added the header to our site to be able to receive them. We've sent a mention, we've received a mention, and we've even displayed a mention. Almost. We have all the pieces in place. So maybe at the end of the demo that will be ready. But why would we go through all of this effort? What is there for us to gain? And the answer is that you own your content and how it's displayed. So that reply that I posted on jamestu.coffee, I own that. So even though codename.lol can display it in the way that they want, I still have my copy. So on my site, I can have a feed of all my comments, all my likes, all my bookmarks. And I'm not limited to kind of just posting on someone else's site and then losing track of me posting that comment, which I think is especially important for longer form comments that you write. If you're reading an academic work and you've got a lot of comments, rather than just put it in the comments section, you may want to be able to easily refer back to that. So what better way to do so than have your content on your own site and be able to display it in as creative a way as you choose. The web mention spec embodies a principle called POSSE, which in its unabbreviated form says publish on your own website and then syndicate elsewhere. So what we just did is published on jamestu.coffee and then syndicated all the way over to codename.lol. POSSE lets you own your original content and then syndicate it elsewhere. And again, if you syndicate original content, you can choose how to display it on your personal websites. So you can mark up and design your replies how you like. You can let your creative juices flow and no longer be limited by the user interfaces dictated by larger platforms. And of course, a couple examples. Aaron Preki, this is how he shows his replies. So this was something somebody posted on Mastodon, and then Aaron replied to it from his personal website and has a copy here. Well, the original here and the copy would be on Mastodon. He shows it one way. Tantek, on his site, he has likes on GitHub issues, on a podcast, and then even a response to someone else's post, all in the same place, but again, in a completely different style. And then on my site too, I like to post RSVPs on jamestu.coffee, and I have a feed of them, which is to say that I have a full log of all of the online events that I've attended because I posted them on my site, and it's a URL that I can send to anyone. So if somebody says, hey, James, what events did you attend this year? I can say, here you go. And I didn't have to create anything extra. I already had all that information. And then, of course, for the people who really want to dive into this, there's plenty of things you can do by having all of this content. You could play around with building link graphs and even visualization showing the different types of content that you have responded to or liked or bookmarked over time. But what can you do with web mentions aside from post comments? We just spoke about and showed many examples of posting comments on personal websites, which is great, but there's so much more that we can do. And I think this is where it gets really exciting. Ultimately, at its core, web mention is just this post request and kind of all of the tasks that the server does, but we can do more. We can send a comment, sure, but we can also, as I've mentioned, post a like or bookmark. You can vote on a poll that's been set up with Webmention. I played around with this and it was super fun. You can RSVP to a post, and there's so many other things that you can do too. I have on 2 occasions played tic-tac-toe with people around the world using Webmention. Now, many of all of these ideas are enabled by small pieces of HTML markup, which are referred to as microformats. We add these in the class section of a HTML element, usually a link, but it could be another element too. And this additional semantic information tells a platform or rather tells a web mention provider, hey, this post is a reply to another post, or this post is a like of another post, or a bookmark of, or an RSVP to a post. So here's how I show polls on my site. This page on my website accepts web mention, and the question was, how often do you have milk in your tea? And I got 2 votes from this. In order to vote, you would send a web mention to the page, and if you mentioned always in your web mention, 1 vote will be added to always. If you mentioned sometimes, 1 vote will be added, and so on. So in this way, I didn't worry about extending the specification. I just manipulated the web mentions that came in and looked for this specific information, like always, sometimes, never. So this is live at jamesg.blog/poll. So you too could send a web mention here. That's one example. IndieWeb community members can respond to events with web mentions. So this is one example. I posted a response to an event saying I was excited to co-host a homebrew website club, and it showed up on the events page. I thought I'd do a demo of this because it's pretty fun. On IndieWeb events, we have one coming up on Wednesday. I can RSVP to this from my personal website. So if I go to jamesg.coffee again, and I go to an RSVP, I can say, here's the link to the event. Yes, I'll attend, and say, maybe I'm excited, and say save. And after that is posted on my website, it will show up in my feed of responses. And what's going on behind the scenes here is my personal website added one of those special reply to links to indicate that I'm RSVPing to this. And also on the yes, there is a PRSVP with a value yes, saying, hey, yes, I do want to attend this event. So I posted it on my blog here. Now I need to go send it. So if I go to, where are we? Telegraph, and I send a web mention from here to events, or rather to the event page. It'll be pending and accepted. And if I go back to the events page, we should see, hopefully, here we are, my RSVP. So it says, hey, I'm going. And yes, I'm excited, which I just posted. So through Webmention, I said, hey, I wanted to RSVP to this post. I did, and it shows up on both my site and the events page. There's also Indie News, a news aggregator that's powered by Webmentions. So on Indie News, you can publish something, link to Indie News, send Indie News a web mention, and then it'll show up in here. So there's some posts by Tantek, there's some by me, there's one on returning to blogging, and there's some that were from a little while ago that got added, some text posts. And all of these were originally posted on someone else's site and they opted to syndicate. In this way, you can consider web mentions as a way to get more exposure for your content. Publish on your site, syndicate elsewhere. And as a site owner, you control the logic for what happens when you receive mentions. So as I said earlier, I controlled how my poll was set up, but there's plenty more you can do. One example I love that I've been working on for a while now is called Breakfast and Coffee, which is an open wiki where all posts are written on people's personal websites and then syndicated and aggregated on the wiki. So in this sense, Breakfast and Coffee is acting as both an aggregator and also a place on which you can publish contents. So sending a web mention lets you create a new wiki page if one doesn't exist, add a review to a new page, to an existing page, or even generate maps on pages. So this is one coffee review I posted on my site of a cafe in Leeds in England. And I said, hey, I had a great cold brew in this cafe. And then I sent a web mention to Breakfast and Coffee, and then added a bunch of stuff. Hidden on my page was the coordinates for the cafe. And then from that, it got the location, Leeds, UK. It also got the my star rating. If somebody else posted a review of the same cafe, they could send a web mention and it would get added to this post, and then it would say 2 ratings and then change the number of stars. So with web mention, I can syndicate loads of content. And let me share another example too. So I've posted a lot of Edinburgh Cafe reviews on Breakfast and Coffee. And by using web mention, I notify Breakfast and Coffee that I posted this content. So if I go to this one on the milkman, I originally posted it on my site, which you can see here. But Breakfast and Coffee took the contents and then aggregated it into a whole map with all of the cafes. So this is web mention at work. When you notify sites that you've linked to them and add in some additional information, like maybe a review or maybe an RSVP, there's a lot that can be done with it. And let's see. Go back here. And then you can even post your social media accounts from your websites. That's enabled for a tool called Bridgie. Bridgie lets you take your posts and syndicate them to social media accounts. To get started, sign up to Bridgie. The link's here. That's the domain name. Connect any social media accounts you want, a link to Bridgie in posts, and then send a mention to Bridgie. So in this way, Bridgie is kind of like a middle party. So you can link to your GitHub and then post content on GitHub. You can link to your Twitter, and then when you post something on your personal website, and you link to Bridgie, then Bridgie will post that thing to Twitter too when they receive a web mention. So what if I told you that we could publish GitHub issues on our personal website? That is indeed possible with web mention. So we'll do a quick demo here. Let's see. We will go to jamestree.coffee and then we will go over to a GitHub repository. Let's take this intro to web mentions one that we had earlier. I can, on my personal website, write a new post. Let's say this is an issue. And then add a link to the issues page of that GitHub post. So I can say, and then add one of those classes you are applied to. And then that, and then say like this is an issue about the repository. And then I'll add in this all magical Bridgie link. This Bridgie link tells Bridgie that if I send a mention to Bridgie and it has this link, then use my GitHub account, which I've authenticated to on this tool earlier, signing in again with my domain name to submit a post on my behalf. So with that said, we can let this go. We can take the URL of our content and then paste it into Bridgie, where again, I authenticated with Bridgie earlier. So I can enter a post URL, which is this one I just posted. It's going to see that I want to create a new issue on this repository. It got the title and the text, and then I can click send. And again, I could do command line, Python, whatever. Oh, interesting. Apparently, I've already sent that. Interesting. Did that show up? We shall see. Yeah, there we go. So we just published something, open now. It's an issue about the repository. That text I posted on my site showed up on GitHub, and with the syndication link too. And I have 2 minutes left. Let's be quick. Luckily, I'm coming toward the end. The Webmention spec supported by dozens of publishing tools, from WordPress to micro.blog to Drupal, and there's plenty of other tools you can add to. You'll need an extension for WordPress or Drupal, but there's plenty of documentation online to get you started. And it's a standard. So you can write your own codes to receive, send, manipulate, and display web mentions however you choose. And plus, there's plenty of people in the indie web community who'd be happy to help you get started. And then that's it. So with that in mind, to find out more, you can go to indieweb.org/webmention, where there's plenty of information on how to get started and dozens of examples of personal sites. And we also have an open discussion page too, indieweb.org/discuss, where you can join us in Slack, Discord, IRC. All the chats are bridged together, which means whatever platform you join, you'll see messages on every other platform too. Definitely in the spirit of syndication and supporting bridges between different platforms. And we'd be more than happy to help you get started with Webmention, posting comments, sending likes, sending bookmarks. And with that, that's all. So thank you so much for joining the talk. Feel free to check out my blog, jamesg.blog, or email me at the email address on jamesg.blog. And we can help you get set up with web mentions and posting content on your own personal websites. So with that, thank you very much.